Hello, hello. It's Eileen here, and I've got a quick update that I wanted to be sure to share with you before we dive into today's episode. The Resilience Room membership community is going to open its doors for new members Monday, July 28th through Friday, August 1st. If you've been thinking of joining us and want to be sure to be notified when we open, I want to encourage you to join the waitlist. You can do that at go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. That's go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. We only open our doors for new members a few times per year, so if you've been thinking about joining, this is a great time for you to do that. We would love nothing more than to welcome you into our amazing community. So again, you can find all the details and join the waitlist at go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. Okay, on to the episode. So this mom was sharing with me that she would talk to her teenage son about something that needed to be done or their plans later for the day. I mean, it was pretty routine stuff. And her son appeared to be listening and appeared to be engaged. He would nod his head, which she felt was a nod in understanding. And he would even repeat back to her what she had said. And so, of course, it left her feeling like there was this clear understanding between them about whatever it is that they discussed, that they were on the same page. So you can imagine why she was so frustrated when sometimes her son would go and do the exact opposite of what was discussed. It was as though their conversation never happened. Hi there, and welcome to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Devine, and I am a therapist, parent coach, and educator who supports parents that are raising children, teens, and young adults with brain-based differences and challenging behavioral symptoms. If you are a parent or caregiver of a child who has intense, confusing, relentless, or sometimes even scary behaviors, you are in the right place, and I am so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back. You are listening to the Brain First Parenting Podcast, and I am your host, Eileen Devine. And today we're going to talk about one of those things that if you are neurotypical, meaning you identify as someone whose brain works typically as society would expect it to, then you do this thing automatically without thinking. Every day, all day long. But if you have a brain that works differently, it is not so easy. In fact, it's super complex, and when we actually pause for a moment to consider how the brain is involved in this thing we're going to talk about today, it's no wonder that so many of our kids and our teens and young adults with brain differences struggle with it so much. What we're talking about today is having a simple, pretty routine, back and forth conversation with another person. We do this with strangers, with coworkers, with families, with friends, with neighbors. It is how we connect. It's how we get our needs met. It's how we express ourselves. Being able to effectively communicate through conversation with other people significantly impacts our daily quality of life. It also significantly impacts our relationships. It's huge. This inability to participate in a simple, routine, back and forth conversation is a frustration I hear about from parents all the time. They are frustrated, they're confused, they are often at their wits' end because it seems like such a simple and reasonable expectation. So when their child or their teen isn't participating in the conversation, they're not engaging, they're not talking, it feels personal. It feels like defiance. It feels like it's on purpose. And it can also feel like a form of rejection. And none of that feels good. But here's the thing. Having a back and forth conversation isn't simple at all. Not when we're looking at it through this brain first lens. How is the brain involved? And the layers of complexity inherent in this seemingly simple expectation. Let's talk. Let's have a conversation about this, right? When your child or your teen or your young adult has a brain that works differently, they have to have accommodations to be able to be successful in this area so that they can actually then participate fully in that conversation. Recently, one of the parents I work with was telling me about this, well, for her, very confusing at the time, definitely maddening behavior, exhausting behavior that her teenage son was exhibiting. And it was a pattern that she was noticing was happening frequently, and it was beginning to feel very personal to her, very intentional, and she wanted to be able to shift her lens on it. And I thought it was such a great example of what parents experience and also how these behaviors can appear to us in the moment through what is for many of us our default lens, which is that behavioral lens, how it can appear so intentional. But once we start peeling back the layers and we see that complexity that's involved, again, all related to cognitive skills and what the brain needs to do for us to have that conversation, when we start to see it through that brain first lens, it gives us a very different picture of what actually is going on. And what was frustrating then begins to make more sense. And then we actually know what we can do about it to make it better. So this mom was sharing with me that she would talk to her teenage son about something that needed to be done or their plans later for the day. I mean, it was pretty routine stuff. And her son appeared to be listening and appeared to be engaged. He would nod his head, which she felt was a nod in understanding. And he would even repeat back to her what she had said. And so, of course, it left her feeling like there was this clear understanding between them about whatever it is that they discussed, that they were on the same page. So you can imagine why she was so frustrated when sometimes her son would go and do the exact opposite of what was discussed. It was as though their conversation never happened. And the most confusing piece of it for this mom was when she would address it with her son, he would get really defensive. Sometimes he would lash out. Sometimes he would shut down. Many times he would claim ignorance. So he'd say things like, "How was I supposed to know? You didn't tell me." And she was like, "I did tell you. We just talked about this." Or he would say to her, "You should have explained it better. That's not what you said." And she's like, "That's exactly what I said. Like, were we even in the same conversation?" So she was understandably baffled about why this was happening, why he was behaving this way, and why it appeared to her that they were on the same page when they had the conversation, only to have him act as though he wasn't even there. And again, she was working really hard to stay curious about it, to see it through a brain first lens, but she was getting very sucked into this feeling of being manipulated. And she was really struggling with how to respond, what to do next. So that's when we begin to take a closer look at, well, what skills are required to do this seemingly easy thing, like have a conversation. And then from there, asking ourselves, does my child have that skill? Is there a poor fit here that maybe I didn't see before? So I want to talk about some of the cognitive skills that are involved in having a productive, clear conversation with another person, because the list is very long. We're not going to exhaust the list today. I just want to give you some examples because this is often where parents have the steepest learning curve. Like, okay, I know it's a brain thing, but like what cognitive skills are involved? I can't even think of them. So I want to give you some examples, and every single one of these that we'll talk about are skills that we know individuals of all ages with brain-based differences commonly struggle with. So not being able to express concerns or needs or thoughts or emotions in words, not having the ability to do that, not being able to wait and hold on to a thought until the other person is done with what they are saying, basically not being able to take their turn in that back and forth conversation. Or it could be being extra chatty, so talking excessively, but never actually reaching a point, and definitely not allowing for back and forth conversation. And the attempts at interrupting them or redirecting them or having them slow down are not at all successful. Another really common lagging skill, being able to talk the talk, but not walk the walk. So we heard this in the example with this mom. That's exactly what she was describing. Her son was saying one thing, or he was nodding his head in agreement and understanding, and then he does something entirely different. He can talk better than he actually understands. Poor memory is also really common. So if the conversation involves your child telling you what happened at school or recalling some series of events, there's a high likelihood that they'll get it wrong. And these memory gaps can definitely feel at times like we're being lied to or manipulated. There's actually a term for it. It's called confabulation, and we won't go into that today. But if this resonates with you and you've never heard that term before, I'd highly recommend that you Google it, and maybe we'll cover it in a future episode. But anyways, this lagging memory skills or confabulation, it makes conversations about past events really, really challenging. Another common one is not being able to keep up with the back and forth conversation. So being able to listen and process what they are hearing in real time, pretty much at the same time. This is often when we're talking, we're thinking that everything we're saying is clear, but they keep asking, what? Right? And we're like, what do you mean, what? Aren't you keeping up with the conversation? No, they're probably not, right? Or you ask them a seemingly simple question that you know they have an answer for, and they respond with, I don't know. You're like, what do you mean you don't know? Yes, you know. What does that feel like when that's the response you get? If you see it through a behavioral lens, they're being disrespectful. They're choosing not to listen. They're ignoring me, right? What if they cannot keep it up with the back and forth of the conversation? They're only hearing every third word. Emotional regulation skills are also a huge factor in having conversations, especially when the conversation is about something that didn't go so well and requires some follow-up, some sort of discussion. If your child is unable to tolerate that discomfort of mom or dad talking to me about something I did that I probably shouldn't have done, that I know I might now be getting in trouble for, you will see behaviors that reflect their inability to regulate through that discomfort. So it could look like laughing, getting super silly. It could look like shutting down and refusing to talk at all. It could look like storming out of the room or getting more verbally aggressive. All of those are signs that your child or your teen has this really narrow window of tolerance and their inability to have this conversation because of those lagging emotional regulation skills. This lagging skill makes it difficult, if not impossible, for them to be logical or reasonable or rational during these types of conversations. And when we continue to push forward in the conversation because we feel it's really important to address this in this moment, no wonder it goes poorly. So it doesn't mean you can't have that conversation. It means in that moment, you're recognizing this is beyond their skill set. They can't do it right now. I've got to back off and we'll revisit it later. The last one that I wanted to mention is emotional and social skills. So much of us having successful conversations with other people is about our ability to put ourselves in their shoes and trying on their perspective, right? Simply acknowledging their perspective, even if we don't agree with it. But when you have a child who lags behind in this particular skill and cannot see or appreciate or acknowledge someone else's perspective or their point of view, it can make a conversation with them really exhausting and really frustrating. right? So these are just a few examples of the ways lagging cognitive skills can play out with our kids who have brain-based differences when we're trying to have simple back and forth conversations with them. When we assume that our child or our teen can participate in a simple conversation with us, but it's not happening, and we continue to just push. We just kind of try to bulldoze our way through it. We continue to push them to do this without seeing that there's a skill deficit here, then there will be more defensive behaviors, those challenging behaviors, right? Those behaviors I mentioned earlier, like excessive laughter or silliness or shutting down, or them lashing out in some hurtful way. This is a super common, not to mention completely exhausting cycle to fall into as a parent, and I do not want this for you. It is a waste of your precious and limited energy. So let's talk for a moment then, how do we get out of this cycle? Or even better, how do we prevent it from happening in the first place? Well, you'll probably know what I'm going to say. If you've listened to this podcast at all, you know we always begin with working to get a little bit of space between that behavior and our knee-jerk response so that we can ask ourselves, what if this fill-in-the-blank behavior has to do with their brain? What if this conversation that I really want to have with them is bumping up against their cognitive skills? This is always the first step, working to see the behaviors for what they are, that brain-behavior connection. And from there, we ask ourselves if there's more support that's needed. Do they need accommodations that we just didn't recognize before? But now we see it, and where can we put in those added layers of support for them so that they can actually have this conversation with us? So some of those simple accommodations, I want to give you some ideas. Checking for understanding versus assuming that they followed the entire conversation and that you're both on the same page. So finding ways to check for understanding and trying to do that in a way that does not involve another conversation with them, right? So something other than verbal interaction. Getting your point across in the least amount of talking necessary. Just using less words. Keeping it as short as you can. If you're like me, you're a talker. This is really hard. I have to be reminded of it all the time, right? Less words is better. Along those lines, if your child or your teen is expected to communicate information to you from other people, like another adult, say a teacher or their coach, connect with that adult and let them know you need to have the information from them directly. Do not rely on your child to do that, right? Relying on your child or even your teenager who chronologically is at an age where you think they should be able to do that, it is just setting them up to fail because they're missing the conversation with that teacher and that coach. They're not able to then hold it and be able to relay it to you later. Another simple accommodation, writing things down. So, or creating some other sort of visual to reinforce and to clarify what it was that you discussed. So the directions, the instructions, the agreements, whatever it might be, in addition to that initial conversation that you had with them. If your child or your teen is stuck in that chatty mode that I mentioned earlier, that excessive talking, a really effective accommodation is to let go of your need to have the conversation that you planned on having, because it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in that moment, no matter how hard you push forward. And so instead, distract them with playfulness or humor, or maybe offering a favorite snack or some other positive distraction that can help them transition out of that in a way that feels good for both of you. It never feels good to them or to us when we reach our limit with their chatty mode and we reach out in frustration and exhaustion. I'm speaking from personal experience here. I want you to conserve your energy and let go of the need to have that conversation and work on getting them unstuck and in a different mode instead. and being on the lookout for behaviors that give you an indication of how your child is feeling so that they don't need to relay it to you verbally. You're not relying on them 100% to communicate how they're feeling. This could be you connecting the dots that your child engages in some sort of behavior, like, for example, picking at their skin excessively when they're anxious about an upcoming event, or you recognize that they become really sassy in their tone with you and more defiant, so more rigid in their behavior when they are overwhelmed by something going on in their life, that it doesn't have to do with you. It has to do with something else that they are overwhelmed or anxious about. Or maybe they say or they do hurtful things when they're feeling sad or feeling frustrated or feeling ashamed of themselves. So for us to be looking for those behaviors that help us understand how they're feeling and what's going on in their internal world, so that we don't have to put that weight on them to verbally communicate and having a conversation with us about it. When you know the conversation might be tricky, or maybe it's about some sort of sensitive topic, what I want to encourage you to do is look for an opportunity to have that conversation when your child is settled, to ease into it with them, rather than just jumping into it without any forethought, right? So looking for the opportunity when your child's regulated to be able to ease into the conversation with them. And if you see that it's challenging for them, for their emotional regulation skills, even when you've done that, and it's challenging them to such a degree that you start to see those defensive symptoms ramp up, like the lashing out or the excessive silliness or any of the other ones that might happen, back off, right? And try again later. It's such a generous and compassionate accommodation to give our kids. And then finally, a universal accommodation, accepting the need to reteach, knowing that the ability to pick up every piece of the conversation that you've had with them is probably pretty limited. And so you'll need to have the conversation over again, whatever the points were that you wanted to get across in that conversation, coming back to it, like we talked about, in a different way or in another conversation, accepting their need for repetition and reteaching. All right. I hope this episode was helpful to you. Basically, to get the wheels turning, right, in our own brains about why is this such a point of frustration for us, certainly for our kids, when they're met with that expectation, they have no way to be successful in it without more support from us, and what you can actually do to support them and help things go more smoothly the next time you enter into a conversation with them. You are never alone in this, and I'm so glad that you're here listening in. Until next time, take care. Hey, before we say goodbye, I wanted to be sure you are aware of a free workshop that I created for parents just like you that you can access for free and instantly. It's called Brain First, the Essential Framework for Parenting Your Child with Challenging Behaviors. And you can access this workshop at go.eileendivine.com/free workshop. Again, that's go.eileendivine.com/free workshop. I hope it's helpful to you as you work so hard to support your complex child.